Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful and inspiring journeys of love, betrayal, and self-discovery. Today's story is about Emily, a woman who finds herself at a crossroads after her husband's betrayal during her pregnancy. Feeling abandoned and heartbroken, she embarks on a journey of healing, learning to rediscover her strength and worth. Will she be able to let go of the past and build a future for herself and her child? Stay with us as we dive into this emotional and transformative tale. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey with us. Let me tell you the story of Emily. She was 8 months pregnant, eagerly awaiting the arrival of her first child. They had spent so many years planning for this moment. Their penthouse was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of love and warmth. But on this night, Emily sat alone in the dimly lit bedroom, her hand resting absent-mindedly on her swollen belly. Rubbing it softly, she could feel the baby shifting. But instead of joy, it only reminded her of the emptiness that had settled in her heart. You see, Emily should have been glowing with excitement, savoring each kick and preparing for the new life they would soon hold in their arms. But the reality was different. Her mind was consumed with loneliness. David, her husband, was hardly ever home. When he was, he barely looked at her, let alone spoke to her with the tenderness he once had. His eyes, once full of affection, were now distant, and his touch felt as if it was merely out of obligation. The days stretched on with the same routine. David would leave early in the morning with vague excuses about work, and he would return late at night. But when he did, it was as though the world around him had shifted. Emily tried everything to revive their connection. She cooked his favorite meals. Despite the exhaustion of pregnancy, she dressed up, hoping that he would notice her, that he would see the woman he had once loved. But nothing worked. His indifference grew with each passing day, and the weight of it crushed her spirit. One night, like so many others, David was late again. Emily had already dialed his number once, only to hear it ring endlessly, the voicemail greeting cutting through the silence like a knife. David, it's late. Just wanted to check if you're okay. Please call me back, she sighed, knowing deep down that he wouldn't. He hadn't been there for her. And now, he wouldn't be there for their child either. Her heart skipped a beat when she heard the front door unlock. The familiar sound she had come to expect, even if it no longer filled her with hope. It was 2:13 a.m. when he walked in, his face clouded with irritation. The scent of unfamiliar perfume clung to his clothes like a cruel reminder of the betrayal that had been gnawing at her heart. Emily's stomach twisted with a sickening realization. You're late again, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, betraying the hurt that lingered behind her words. David didn't even look at her as he loosened his tie. I told you, work was hectic, he muttered, his voice sharp, as if her concern was an inconvenience. Emily, fighting the tears that were threatening to spill, spoke in a voice that trembled with emotion. David, I need you. I feel like I'm going through this pregnancy alone. He finally glanced at her, but there was no warmth in his gaze. I'm tired. Let's not do this tonight, he said, walking into the bathroom without a second thought, leaving Emily standing in the dim light, a broken woman fighting to hold on to the little dignity she had left. That night, she lay awake, her thoughts swirling in a storm of confusion and sorrow. Maybe Carol, her best friend, had been right all along. Maybe she had been holding on to a man who had already let go. The late nights, the excuses, the coldness in his eyes, everything was becoming predictable. The lipstick stain on his collar, the scent of a perfume that was not hers. All of it had led her to this painful realization. David had been cheating. She had known it in her heart. But seeing the evidence, the messages, it shattered her hope completely. She had tried to talk to him, but each time, he was either too tired or too busy. The intimacy between them had vanished. She was no longer the woman he adored. Instead, she had become a burden, someone whose presence only seemed to irritate him. Emily couldn't help but wonder when the man she once loved had stopped caring. Had he ever really loved her? Or had she been a stepping stone in his life? Something to discard when it no longer served him? The feeling of betrayal washed over her like a tidal wave, but she couldn't keep the pain to herself. She had to confide in someone before it consumed her. And so, she called Carol. Emily, You're 8 months pregnant, and he's running around like a bachelor? That's not normal, Carol said, her voice filled with concern and disbelief. Emily swallowed hard, trying to convince herself that maybe she was overthinking it. Maybe he's just stressed, she whispered, but even as she said the words, she knew they didn't ring true. Carol wasn't having any of it. No, Emily, you're hoping. There's a difference. A man in love doesn't abandon his pregnant wife like this. If he's cheating, you need to know. Emily shook her head, refusing to believe it. She just needed David to be present, to love her like he used to. But Carol's words echoed in her mind, and the seed of doubt began to take root. Maybe it's time to find out the truth, Emily, before it destroys you. That was when everything began to change. The next morning, Emily found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling in the quiet darkness. Her mind was consumed by the conversation she had with Carol, and the seed of doubt that had been planted began to grow. Could David really be cheating on her? Every time she reached out, he pushed her away, and it wasn't just a matter of him being busy. The silence between them was deafening, and every day it became harder to ignore the sinking feeling in her chest. Her eyes flickered to the nightstand, where David's phone sat. It had been vibrating earlier, but he had been fast asleep beside her, his back turned as though he had already distanced himself from her even in his dreams. Emily hesitated. She had never been the type to snoop, but the seed of suspicion had grown so loud that she couldn't ignore it. Her fingers hovered over the screen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to know the truth. With a deep breath, Emily reached for his phone, the cool surface of the device sending a shiver through her fingertips. Her mind raced. What if she found something she wasn't ready to see? What if her worst fears were true? She hesitated, but the nagging doubt gnawed at her, refusing to let go. As she unlocked the phone, another message notification popped up, and her breath caught in her throat. Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing. Love you. The name of the sender, Carmen. Emily's hand trembled, the words on the screen burning into her mind. Her stomach twisted, and a cold, sickening wave of realization washed over her. She had suspected, but seeing the evidence, the proof of David's infidelity, was a crushing blow. The man she had given everything to, the man who was supposed to be her partner, had been sleeping with another woman all along. The tears she had been holding back fell silently down her cheeks, leaving a trail of sorrow in their wake. She felt a knot tighten in her chest, but she steeled herself. She couldn't let David continue to break her heart without confronting him. Emily turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper, but laced with pain. David, wake up. He groaned, rubbing his eyes, but when he looked at her, the expression on his face wasn't one of concern. It wasn't even guilt. Instead, there was irritation, as if being awakened from his slumber was an inconvenience. She held up the phone, the damning message still glowing on the screen. Who is Carmen? She asked, her voice sharp with the anger that had been building inside her. For a moment, David stared at her in disbelief, his mind scrambling for an excuse, a lie that could cover up the truth. But Emily had no patience left for his games. Don't even try to deny it, she snapped, her voice rising in fury. You've been cheating on me. I saw the messages. David sat up in bed, rubbing his temples as if her confrontation was nothing more than an inconvenience. It's not what you think, Emily, he muttered, his voice dismissive. You're overreacting. Overreacting? Emily repeated, her voice trembling with disbelief. I'm 8 months pregnant with your child, while I've been here alone, worrying about us, about our baby. You've been sleeping with another woman. You didn't even care enough to check on me when I was fighting for my life. David looked at her, his face hardened, his tone cold. I don't need this drama right now, he said, swinging his legs out of bed and walking towards the bathroom as though their marriage had never mattered. Emily stood there, her body shaking with rage and heartbreak. She had once believed in their love, in their future together, but now, all of that felt like a distant memory, slipping through her fingers like sand. She was no longer the woman he adored, but a burden, and it crushed her soul to realize that the love she had fought so hard for had been nothing more than an illusion. The next few days passed in a blur of heartache and emotional exhaustion. Emily could barely focus on anything. The days stretched long and empty, each one a reminder of the betrayal that had shattered her world. David had moved out temporarily. Or at least that was the excuse he had given. She knew, deep down, that he wasn't just staying away for work. He was with Carmen. It was almost unbearable to think about. The thought of him with someone else while she was left to suffer in silence. Carrying their child alone. Her pregnancy, which should have been a time of joy, now felt like a burden. Something she was forced to carry without any support. Every time she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw the woman she had once been. She was just a shell, worn down by the relentless weight of rejection and pain. The loneliness was suffocating, and no matter how many friends reached out or how many times she tried to distract herself, the hollow feeling in her chest never went away. One evening, as Emily stood in the kitchen preparing tea, a sudden wave of dizziness hit her. The room spun, and before she could steady herself, sharp pain shot through her belly. Panic surged through her, and she gasped for breath, clutching the counter for support. Something was wrong, and her mind immediately raced to the worst-case scenario. Was the stress too much? Was her body failing under the weight of it all? She quickly grabbed her phone, dialing Carol's number with trembling hands. "Carol, I don't feel good," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with fear. My head, my belly, something's wrong." Carol's voice sharpened with concern, the motherly tone she had always carried rising to the surface. "Emily, what's happening? Are you having contractions?" Emily struggled to keep herself upright, the dizziness overwhelming her. Another wave of pain crashed over her, making it impossible to stay steady. "I don't know. My head, my belly, please. I don't know what's happening." Before she could finish, everything went black. When Emily regained consciousness, the sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, and bright fluorescent lights blazed overhead. She groggily opened her eyes, trying to piece together what had happened. The last thing she remembered was clutching the counter in her kitchen. Then everything had gone dark. Now, she was in a hospital room, her body aching from the strain. But there was a comforting presence beside her. Carol was holding her hand tightly, her face etched with worry. "You scared me half to death," Carol said, her voice trembling slightly. "The doctors said your blood levels are dangerously low. You need a transfusion immediately." Emily swallowed hard, her mind sluggish from the ordeal. "I need to call David," she muttered, though she already knew what the outcome would be. He hadn't cared enough to show up before. Why would he now? Carol snapped, her anger flaring. "Forget him, Emily," she said sharply. "You need someone who actually cares." But Emily couldn't bring herself to let go of the last shred of hope. The belief that David might change, might show up when it mattered most. She pressed the call button anyway, but her heart sank as the phone rang. And rang, and rang. There was no answer, no concern, nothing. The doctor came in, offering a soft reassurance that there might be a donor for her transfusion. Emily's breath caught in her throat, as she thought of the stranger who might be the only person capable of saving her life. But just as she was beginning to lose herself in the pain of abandonment, the door opened, and a nurse stepped in with a hopeful look. "We may have a donor," the nurse said, stepping aside to reveal a tall man with warm brown eyes and a calm, reassuring presence. "I'm Sam," he said with a soft smile, his voice steady. "I couldn't just stand by and do nothing." Emily blinked in surprise. A stranger was willing to help her. Yet her own husband had abandoned her in her time of need. Gratitude and sorrow swirled within her. But Sam's presence felt like a lifeline she hadn't realized she was desperately grasping for. As the nurse began the transfusion, Emily felt the warmth of Sam's support. A gentle, unwavering presence. She didn't know this man, but in that moment, he was more of a comfort than David had been in months. She couldn't help but wonder how she had let herself be so blind to the man who had truly cared for her. And as the transfusion began to take effect, Emily felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The days that followed Emily's collapse were a blur of exhaustion and overwhelming emotions. She was physically recovering from the transfusion, but emotionally, she felt torn apart. David's absence weighed heavily on her heart. But it was also in these quiet moments, these fragile moments, that Emily began to realize something important. She had been living for David, clinging to the hope that he would love her the way he once had. But it wasn't just his love she had been yearning for, it was her own sense of worth. She had forgotten that she deserved to be loved, not just by others, but by herself. As the days passed, Emily's body began to heal. And with each small improvement, her mind cleared a little more. It wasn't easy. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw David's face, his cold indifference, and her heart would shatter anew. But, amidst the pain, there was a shift within her. She no longer saw herself as the victim of his betrayal. She was a mother now, carrying the responsibility of a life that depended on her. And for the first time in months, Emily realized that maybe she had been living for the wrong person. Sam visited her often, checking in to make sure she was okay. His visits were brief, but they were filled with a quiet kindness that made her feel seen. There was no rush, no expectations, just a steady presence that anchored her in a way she hadn't known was possible. Every time Sam came by, Emily's heart fluttered with something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. He wasn't pushing her to talk or trying to fix things. He simply showed up, and that was all she needed. One afternoon, as Emily rested in the hospital room, Carol sat beside her, her arms crossed over her chest, a deep frown creasing her forehead. "Emily, you need to let him go. For good." Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at the hospital window, watching the world outside, knowing she was no longer a part of it. She had tried to convince herself that David would return, that things would go back to how they were. But the truth was undeniable. He was gone, and she needed to accept it. "I know," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know how to move on from everything we built. It feels like I'm leaving behind more than just him. I'm leaving behind a future I thought I would have." Carol softened, her voice gentle. "You're not leaving anything behind. You're walking away from a life that never really was. You deserve better than this, Emily, and I know Sam will be there for you." The words were like a balm to her wounded soul. They weren't rushed or filled with expectations, they were simply the truth that Emily had been too afraid to face. Carol was right. She had been holding on to a past that was slipping away. She needed to let go. Not for herself, but for her son, for the life she wanted to build. That night, as Emily lay in the hospital bed, a familiar knock came at the door. It was Sam, his usual calm demeanor bringing a small sense of comfort. "How are you doing?" he asked, his voice steady but full of warmth. Emily offered him a small smile, the first genuine one she had given in a while. "Better," she replied, her voice stronger now, her gaze steady. "I think I'm starting to understand what you meant when you said I need to focus on myself." Sam nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "You've been through a lot, Emily, but you don't have to go through it alone. You've got people who care about you. And you've got me." Something in Emily shifted. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a deep sense of connection, of trust. Sam hadn't asked for anything in return. He had simply been there. And for Emily, that was more than enough. The walls she had built around her heart were crumbling, piece by piece. Maybe, just maybe, she was ready to open herself to something new. Something real. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt the flicker of hope. Hope for herself, for her future, and for the life that was just beginning. She wasn't alone, and that was enough for now. As the days passed, Emily's world continued to shift in ways she had never expected. Slowly but surely, she began to rebuild her life. The man who had once made her feel small, the one who had shattered her dreams, no longer held the power to define her. She was no longer defined by David's betrayal, by the lies and coldness that had once consumed her. Emily wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. With Sam's unwavering support, she found herself opening up to the possibility of new love, new beginnings. The fear that had once controlled her was now replaced by strength, resilience, and a deep sense of peace. As she cradled her son in her arms, she realized that she had found the most important thing of all, her own worth. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, times when the weight of the past tried to pull her back. But each day, Emily grew stronger. She had learned the most important lesson, that her happiness didn't depend on anyone else. She had the power to create her own future. As she walked hand in hand with Sam, their son nestled safely in her arms, Emily finally felt free. She had let go of the past, embraced the present, and was now looking forward to the future with hope and courage. David had abandoned her, but in the end, he had given her the greatest gift of all, the strength to let go and move on. Thank you for following Emily's journey. If you've enjoyed her story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring life stories. Your support means the world to us. Stay tuned for more videos that remind us all of the strength we carry within.